Hello, this is Alan Wheeler again, and I'm trying to record blended path number 9. I'm working from notes once again, and the topic here is principles and keys. And I'll post the basic text here in the blog on the website. Let me start by saying that one theoretical mathematics professor broke down knowledge into 3 styles. This is actually the husband of a woman that I work with that teaches at my college. And the first one, he said, was Euclidean, and this is what we usually think of as knowledge, based in traditional logic and reasoning, and it's always consistent. For example, classical physics, Newtonian physics, and we would always expect the same results from the same experiment, or 2 plus 2 to always equal 4. But then he says there's another style of knowledge called heuristics, and these are kind of mental shortcuts we make. They're also based on clear principles, but not always applied consistently, and they work. We use them in practicing law, in learning using languages, playing chess, and perfect example in my line of work is that grammar follows rules, but there are exceptions to every rule, and how we apply that grammar in different contexts can vary, and that's a style of knowledge. The third one that this professor broke down knowledge into, the third category, is intuition. And he says this one is sometimes ineffable, inexpressible. We don't even know how we do it sometimes, and it's based on vast amounts of practice and experience. But it accounts for most skills in the arts and sciences, and yet it's so complex. Now, we could also factor in to knowledge something I teach my students every semester, and that's Aristotle's ideas that we communicate through not just logos, that sheer evidence and logic, but also through pathos and ethos, which mean our emotions and our values. And finding a path to knowledge may be much more complex than simple arithmetic, in other words. So that introduction leads me to one of my half-baked thoughts, which is to someday make a collection of useful principles for considering religion and spirituality and this kind of knowledge. And similar to the way that telephone numbers were designed with only 7 digits because our human minds are limited, I thought keeping the initial list to just a short number, maybe 5, would help me as I scan the landscape of many different beliefs and groups of believers. Can I boil it down to a few keys, trustworthy, I hope, keys and principles to thinking about these beliefs? Let me give you the list of 5. Again, I'll put the text in my blog and then discuss each one briefly. Number 1, conservation of truth. Number 2, partial truth. Number 3, collective truth. 4, freedom in truth. And number 5, dualities and dialogues in truth. So let me start with number 1, which I just called conservation. And the idea here is that perhaps it's a good key or a good principle to keep, to conserve what's good in ideas that came before. And Jesus said when he brought radical new ideas into his culture and faith. He said, I came not to destroy the law, actually, but to fulfill it. Similarly, Buddha did not just rake the landscape of all that came before, although he certainly revolutionized the beliefs and the practices of the Hindu religion. So much like teenagers who feel a rebellious extreme as they learn to be independent, we can feel like rebels too, I think, when we grow in knowledge and in thinking differently. There may be a temptation to throw out the old ideas or to toss out the baby with the bathwater. I know I have to fight the tendency to feel rejected and to fight back sometimes, even against ways that I used to hold dear because of this phenomenon, this tendency. But again, when Jesus and Buddha brought radical change to their respective religions, they showed respect for what came before, in a way bringing a further step or completion to, in the case of Jesus, the old covenants and what the laws intended. He actually brought progress to, or helped to express, or as Buddha, helped to express them in a fresh, new, living, working way. So that was number one, conservation. Number two, partial truth. This is just the idea that we see dimly, we don't see it all. Recognizing that, like the blind men around the elephant in the old poem, the old parable, they each may have had a piece of the truth, but they didn't see the entirety of that elephant. The Apostle Paul wrote that we see dimly as in a dark mirror, even if one day we hope to see fully. Even as we may be fully known, he argued that now we only know in part. There are mysteries. And this came up in the famous chapter on love, when Paul was arguing that love is more important than knowledge. So I think it's obvious that we are dealing in mysteries and things we don't know. But sometimes our dim revelations, the small insights that we do have, bring pride and division instead of love, which is actually the purpose of real knowledge, according to Paul and most religions, I think. Paul said, love builds up, but knowledge puffs up. And Rumi called love the astrolabe of the soul, the astrolabe of the soul. He said, love is the astrolabe of God's mysteries. A lover may hanker after this love or that love, but finally, at last, he is drawn to the most high love, to the highest love. However much we describe and explain and expound on love, when we fall in love, we are ashamed of our words. And so Rumi brings in the inexpressible, transcendental aspect there. Number three is collective truth. The idea here is that we need the group, the universals, or the consensus reality. So this is in a way the converse side to number two, that we see in part, that we just have partial truth. And this, again, can be seen by the poem, the parable of the blind men, that we're each touching different parts of the elephant. Well, we could consider them having pieces of the puzzle, that maybe when we get together and compare notes, we see a bigger picture. We balance and tune one another, to say the least. So this in the Christian faith, the idea is that we have the mind of Christ as a group, not just one pope, not just one individual, but the Spirit speaks through the many. And even in just secular life, we know both critical thinking, where we break apart ideas, and synthesis, where we harmonize and bring together ideas, both work well among a network of folks. And hence we have brainstorming groups and um, writers of TV shows that work as groups, and collaborative learning is important. Now, this can work, this collective consensus idea can work whether it's high culture, elitist, or low culture, where the folk get together and share lore and ideas. As a balance to that, because the demanding that the collective be followed can lead to groupthink and legalism. So number 4 is that freedom is an important principle or key, and that knowledge requires individual thought and diversity. So there must be room for dissent and investigation and personal engagement of knowledge. In the movie World War Z, there was a principle dramatized called The 10th Man. And early in the movie, a strange plague was attacking Jerusalem. And they used this principle where the 10th person was sent out to check out a minority report, no matter how crazy. And in this case, the report was that dead people were walking. And although it was unthinkable, they said, we will check this out anyway. And so this kind of pluralism, this kind of freedom allows for outliers and boundary breakers to influence the status quo, to think outside the collective box. Something that's very important, as there's always more to learn, and perhaps infinite aspects and ways of looking at things. Number 5 of these principles and keys I've called dualities and dialogue. And this is an attitude of open discussion. And the idea here, a little different from just sheer individual freedom, but it's a balance to the some of the other ideas, I think, in a different way, in that oftentimes polarizing is necessary, even within like-minded groups. There are necessary tensions that need to be held in balance, not necessarily solved immediately. Art and science working together, justice and mercy working together, the left brain and the right brain. For example, action and passivity. And whether cycles or different mixtures of these ideas, there are times when they need to be used together in combination. So many religions, for example, recognize God as both transcendent, beyond what we can imagine, think, or know, or experience, and also immanent, close to each one of us. The extremes of paradoxes like this cannot always be held in view simultaneously. And so one may have emphasis during one time period or one group over another, and yet the necessary emphasis can lead to division, even within oneself, and a kind of cognitive dissonance. So keeping the dialogue open, the dualities open, can help with this. I'll just close with one example of a never-ending dualism that I see, perhaps discussed in part by Emerson in his famous essay on conservatism and liberalism. Tradition, in contrast to change, that seem as eternal as the river of Heraclitus, that was always in flux, and yet there it was geographically between the two banks, existing as a river in identity, yet shifting constantly in form. So, conservatism and liberalism, on the one hand, we need structure, order, and law to maintain consistency. On the other hand, that structure can sometimes lead us to write things in stone and become legalistic. The images and the rules necessary for one time and place get applied far and wide, and therefore some theologians have noted we seem to receive progressive revelation, expanding our understanding over time. And so, for example, temples that were built of stone as a place to meet with the divine are explained in other places as symbols or sacraments of living temples, that humanity is the true temple of God, not that the function of the literal didn't aid in that practice. Or we learn that the important Sabbath, that it was a death sentence to break for the people of the Old Testament. Jesus comes along and says, no, Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath, trying to expand the understanding, perhaps necessary for a time or season to grasp, but misapplied or harshly applied later. So I think it shows the complexity I tried to mention in the beginning, bringing in the styles of knowledge, but perhaps these are some key principles that can help. As Augustine said, in essentials, unity. It's essential we love and live. And in non-essentials, liberty. In all things, of course, love. Thanks for listening, and I hope this is helpful to someone else. It's helping me to think through some of these things. Take care.